Listen to the steel symphony of the urban landscape, a complex harmony of ambition, noise, and the silent dreams of millions. We bring you the stories that compose the music of our lives in stunning detail. Click subscribe now and tune in to the heart of the city. The house had been quiet for 11 months, not the comfortable kind of quiet that settles over a home after a long day, but the hollow kind, the kind that gets into the walls and the floorboards and reminds you, every single morning, that the person who used to fill that silence with coffee sounds and humming and the soft shuffle of slippers is never coming back. My wife passed on a Wednesday in October. Pancreatic cancer. 14 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I held her hand through all of it. Every treatment. Every bad night. Every morning she woke up pretending to feel better than she did because that was the kind of woman she was. Eleanor. 61 years old, and still the most graceful person I had ever known. I'm 64 now. Retired 3 years ago from 31 years as a civil engineer with the county. We had a plan, Eleanor and I. Travel. A cabin somewhere in the Smokies. Grandchildren someday, if our daughter ever settled down long enough to think about it. The plan died with her. What was left was the house in Clearwater, Florida, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a backyard with a fig tree. Eleanor had planted herself the year we moved in, and a retirement portfolio that had done well, very well, because I had been careful and patient for 30 years while other men chased things. The financial advisor told me at my last review that the total picture, including the house, was just north of $800,000. I remember nodding and thinking that Eleanor would have been proud. My daughter is 36. Her name is Diane. She has her mother's eyes, and I discovered slowly and then all at once, almost none of her mother's heart. I didn't see it happening. That's the part I turn over in my mind on quiet nights. The part I can't fully make peace with. A man spends his whole life watching for danger in the right places, bad contracts, unstable ground, structural failures, and he never thinks to look for it sitting across from him at his own kitchen table, asking if he wants more sweet tea. Diane moved back to Clearwater, about 4 months after Eleanor died. She said she was worried about me. She said I needed family around. She and her husband Marcus had been living in Atlanta, where he worked in commercial real estate. And she told me they were going to take some time, get their bearings, maybe look at opportunities on the Gulf Coast. It seemed generous. It seemed like love. Marcus had always been pleasant enough. Firm handshake, good at small talk. The kind of man who remembered your golf handicap and asked about it. I never disliked him. I never fully trusted him either. The way you sometimes just know a thing about a person without being able to say exactly why. But he was Diane's choice, and Eleanor had loved Diane fiercely. And so I kept that feeling filed away somewhere quiet and got on with things. They moved into my guest suite. Diane cooked most nights. She said it was the least she could do, that I needed real food, that she could see I'd been eating badly since her mother died. She wasn't wrong about that last part. I'd been living on frozen meals and too much coffee, and the occasional burger from the place down on Gulf to Bay. Her cooking was good, familiar. The kind of food that made the house feel less empty. The first thing I noticed was the fatigue. I've never been a tired man. Even in retirement, I walked 2 miles every morning, kept up with the yard, had lunch with my old colleague Wallace every other Thursday. But starting around 6 weeks after Diane and Marcus arrived, I started feeling something different. Heavy, dull around the edges. The way you feel the day after a stomach bug when you're not quite sick anymore, but not quite well. I told myself it was grief. I told myself I was 64 and it was Florida, and the heat takes something out of you. Then came the nausea. Then the headaches. Then 3 weeks of what I thought was a gastrointestinal problem, which I was embarrassed about and mostly kept to myself. I went to see my doctor in February. His name is Dr. Harmon Philip Harmon, and he has been my physician for 16 years, since he was fresh out of his residency, and I was in my late 40s, and thought annual checkups were something other people needed. He's a quiet man. Methodical. The kind of doctor who actually listens and doesn't check his phone while you're talking. I sat in the exam room and told him about the fatigue and the nausea.
He asked the standard questions. He ordered blood work, which I expected. He also ordered something he called a heavy metals panel, which I didn't ask about because he said it in the same even tone he used for everything else, and I assumed it was routine. I went home. Diane had made chicken soup. I ate 2 bowls of it. The call came 8 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the backyard pulling up some dead growth around Eleanor's fig tree when my phone rang. It was Dr. Harmon's direct line, not the front desk. I remember thinking that was slightly unusual as I answered. He asked if I could come in, that afternoon if possible. I drove to his office. He brought me into his private office, not an exam room. Another thing that registered as slightly unusual, and he closed the door and sat down across from me, with my chart open on the desk between us, and a look on his face that I recognized. The look a person has when they've been deciding how to say something difficult and have finally decided to say it plainly. "Your arsenic levels are elevated," he said. "Significantly elevated. High enough that I've already consulted with a colleague at Moffitt just to confirm the interpretation of the panel. This is not a borderline result." I heard the words. I understood them individually, but they didn't assemble themselves into meaning right away. I said something like, "I'm sorry. What does that mean exactly?" He explained it carefully. Arsenic poisoning. Not from a single large dose, from repeated small exposures over an extended period. Weeks, possibly longer. It was consistent with my symptoms. The fatigue, the nausea, the GI issues, the headaches. He said that in cases like this, the source was almost always environmental or dietary. He asked about my water supply, my yard, any pesticides, any supplements. I answered his questions. My water was city water. I didn't use pesticides. I took a basic multivitamin. And then, while I was sitting there in that chair, looking at the window, and trying to think of every other possible explanation, something moved through me like cold water, slow at first, and then everywhere at once. The soup, the meals, every night for months. Food I hadn't prepared myself. Dr. Harmon was still talking. He was saying something about reporting requirements and follow-up testing, and I made myself focus on his face. "Philip," I said, using his first name for the first time in 16 years. "Before you report anything to anyone, I need a few days." He looked at me for a long time. He's a careful man, Philip Harmon. He understands things without having them spelled out. "I can document that I'm still gathering information," he said finally. "I can legitimately hold the formal report for 72 hours while I complete my clinical notes." He paused. "I want you to understand what I'm telling you. And I want you to be careful." I thanked him. I drove home. I did not go inside right away. I sat in the driveway in my truck for 22 minutes, watching the lights in the front window and thinking about my wife and my daughter and $800,000 and 36 years of being somebody's father. And then I got to work. The first call I made was to Wallace. We'd been friends for 29 years, long enough that I didn't have to explain much. I told him what I knew. He asked 2 questions, both practical, and then told me to come to his house. I stayed there that night, telling Diane I'd run into an old friend from the county and was staying over. She said to call if I needed anything. Her voice was warm. The second call I made was to an attorney I'd used for some county contract work years ago, Howard Garfield. A precise and thorough man who had never in my experience been rattled by anything. I told him everything. He was quiet for most of it. When I finished, he said he needed to make 2 phone calls of his own and would get back to me within the hour. He called back in 40 minutes with the name of a private investigator. Retired detective, 22 years with Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. Name was Tom Briggs. I called Tom Briggs from Wallace's back porch with the sound of the Gulf somewhere in the distance and the sun going down behind the tree line. Tom met me the next morning. He was a stocky man in his late 50s with the specific stillness that people develop after years of watching other people lie. I told him everything. He took notes. He asked about Marcus's financial situation, which was a question I didn't have a complete answer to, and he said he'd find that. What Tom Briggs found, over the following 11 days, was this. Marcus's commercial real estate business in Atlanta had been quietly failing for almost 2 years. He had debts, significant ones, the kind that don't get better on their own. He and Diane had a joint account that had run down to less than $3,000. There were 2 maxed credit cards in Diane's name that I hadn't known about. There was also, and this was the detail that sat with me hardest, a search history on a laptop legally obtained, Tom explained. Through a source he didn't elaborate on that included searches about arsenic compounds, detection timelines, and symptoms of chronic, low-dose poisoning. The searches had begun 6 weeks before my symptoms started. Marcus's name was on most of those searches, but not all of them. Howard Garfield had been busy during those 11 days as well. I had already, years before, structured my estate carefully, the house in a trust, the investment accounts with designated beneficiaries, a will that Eleanor and I had drafted together and updated twice. Howard reviewed all of it. He made changes, quietly and without involving anyone at my home address. The changes were comprehensive. On the 12th day, Tom Briggs told me he had enough for law enforcement. More than enough. He had been, at my request, coordinating quietly with a contact at the Clearwater Police Department who he trusted. That afternoon, Howard Garfield and I sat in a conference room with 2 detectives and laid out everything. Tom's documentation, Dr. Harmon's medical records, the financial picture. One of the detectives looked at me at one point and said, "Calloway, why didn't you come to us first?" Not accusatory, genuinely curious. I thought about it. Because I needed to know for certain, I said. And because I needed to make sure certain things were in order first. I think he understood. What happened next happened fast. In the way that legal and law enforcement things rarely do but sometimes do when the evidence is clean and the attorneys are prepared. Diane and Marcus were at my house when the detectives arrived. I was not there. Howard had advised against it. And he was right. I was at Wallace's house, sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee that I had made myself, watching a brown pelican work the waterway. Marcus was arrested first. The detectives had done their work thoroughly. The digital evidence, combined with the medical documentation and the financial motive, gave them what they needed. Diane was questioned at length. What came out of that questioning, and Tom told me this carefully, watching my face, was that she had known. Not initially, he thought, but at some point she had known, and she had not stopped it. There were messages between them on a phone Marcus thought he'd deleted. She was arrested 2 days later, charged as a co-conspirator. I won't tell you I was not broken by that. A man can know something and still be broken by it. I knew, somewhere in myself, from the moment I sat in Dr. Harmon's office and the pieces began to fall into place, what the shape of it was. But knowing a thing in your mind and feeling it in your chest when they put handcuffs on your daughter are 2 entirely different experiences. I sat in Wallace's living room that evening, and I did not speak for a long time, and he sat with me and didn't speak either, which is what a good friend does. The legal process moved forward over the following months. Marcus's attorney negotiated. Diane's attorney did the same. I left that to Howard, who handled it with the precision I'd come to expect from him. What I focused on instead was smaller things. Getting well, Dr. Harmon had me on a treatment protocol and monitoring my levels every 3 weeks, and by April they had come down to near normal. Walking my 2 miles again in the mornings, eating meals I cooked myself, or occasionally Wallace cooked, because he'd turned out to be surprisingly decent with a cast-iron skillet. I had the house to myself again. Some nights that felt like loss. Some nights it felt like something else. A quieter kind of space that was, at least, honest. In late March, I went to the nursery on Missouri Avenue where Eleanor used to buy her plants. I needed something for the back corner of the yard near the fence that had gone sparse. The woman who helped me find what I was looking for was named Carol. She was about 60, with silver hair and a directness I appreciated immediately. She knew a great deal about soil conditions in coastal Florida. We talked for almost an hour. When I left, I had 2 knockout rose bushes and a flat of native ground cover, and I had agreed to come back the following Saturday for a container gardening workshop she was running for the spring planting season. I went back the following Saturday, and the one after that. Carol had been widowed 4 years earlier. She had 2 grown sons who lived in other states and called on Sundays. She had started the nursery with her late husband and had kept it going afterward because, she said, plants didn't require you to explain your grief. She said it matter-of-factly, standing there in the greenhouse with potting mix on her forearm, and I thought it was one of the most honest things anyone had said to me in years. We had dinner for the first time in April, at a fish place on the water she recommended. We talked for 3 hours. She made me laugh twice about things that had nothing to do with grief or betrayal or anything heavy at all, and both times it surprised me, the way laughing surprised me now, not like something forgotten, but like something I'd stopped believing was still available. The plea agreements came through in early May. Marcus received 4 years. Diane received 2 years, suspended, with 5 years of supervised probation, based on the assessment that her role had been secondary and she had ultimately provided information during questioning. She was also required to complete a substance abuse evaluation. The investigators had found other things during the process. Things about the years in Atlanta I hadn't known about, which explained some things and raised others. Howard told me the sentencing details by phone. I was standing in the backyard when he called, looking at Eleanor's fig tree, which had put out new growth that spring bright green and reaching upward in a way it hadn't done the year before. I thanked him. I stood there for a while after I hung up. I thought about Eleanor, about the woman who had raised Diane, who would have been shattered by all of this in ways I couldn't fully calculate. I thought about what I owed Eleanor's memory, and what I owed myself, and what, if anything, I still owed my daughter. I wrote Diane a letter. 1 page, handwritten. I told her that I would not pretend this had not happened. I told her that I would not be a resource she could access after she had finished her legal obligations and decided she needed something again. I told her that if she wanted to rebuild something with me someday, not what we had, because what we had turned out to be a version of something real, built on a version of something false, that would require years of her demonstrating, in small, consistent ways, that she was becoming a person capable of it. I told her I hoped she would. I meant it. I mailed the letter, and I did not wait for a response with the particular kind of tension I would have waited with before all of this. I mailed it, and I went on. I had the estate planning reviewed again in the summer. Howard made a few refinements. The house and the primary accounts are in a trust now structured in a way that requires multiple conditions before any distribution can occur. The charitable donations Eleanor had always talked about making to the hospice that had cared for her those last weeks, to a scholarship fund at the technical college where I'd taught a night class for a few years, those are formalized now. Specific and protected. Tom Briggs sent me a bottle of Kentucky bourbon in June with a card that said only, "Good outcome. Stay well." I sent him back a note and a check for an additional fee he hadn't asked for, because he'd done more than was required, and a man who does that deserves to know it was noticed. In July, Carol and I drove up to the Myakka River State Park one Saturday morning and rented a canoe and spent 4 hours on the water looking at birds and talking about almost everything. On the drive back, with the windows down and the warm evening air coming through, she said something about how strange it was to find yourself happy again after being so certain you wouldn't be, that it felt a little like learning a song you'd given up on. I knew what she meant. I told her so. The fig tree produced fruit that August for the first time in 3 years. I stood at the back door in the morning light looking at it and thought about Eleanor, the way she used to pick the figs when they were just right and make jam that she gave away in small jars to everyone on the street. I thought about how much she would have disapproved of what I'd been through and how much, I believed, she would have approved of how I handled it. I picked the figs. I didn't know how to make jam. I called Wallace, who didn't know either. And then I called Carol, who did. She came over that afternoon with her own kitchen tools and a patience for process that I recognized from watching her work with plants. We made 4 jars of fig jam on Eleanor's stove, which felt like honoring something rather than replacing it. I kept 1 jar. I gave 1 to Wallace. I gave 1 to Dr. Harmon, who had seen something in a blood panel and made a careful phone call and, in doing so, given me back my life. The fourth jar I left at the nursery on Missouri Avenue, on the front counter with a small card that said only, "Thank you for the roses." They took. That evening I sat on the back porch in the long Florida dusk, watching the light go amber and then rose, and then the deep blue-gray that settles in just before dark. The fig tree was quiet. The yard smelled the way it had when Eleanor was alive, green and living and particular to this place, that she had made a home for 31 years. I was 64 years old. I was tired of some things and not tired of others. I had been afraid, and I had acted carefully, and I had come through to the other side, still standing, still myself, perhaps more myself than I had been in a long time. A man at 64 does not expect to start over. But sometimes life does not ask what you expect. Sometimes it only asks what you're willing to do next. I thought I knew the answer to that. I went inside and called Carol. She answered on the second ring. We talked until the stars were out.